Welcome, friends and comrades. I'm here with Bianca Stone, who is a poet in Vermont. And Bianca, I've been following for many years, is actually, according to John Ashbery, one of my all-time favorite poets who I mention all the time, a brilliant transcriber of her generation's emerging pathology and sensibility, which I thought was a wonderful endorsement for you.
I know on closer inspection, I'm like, that could be not a good thing. but I know you meant it well.
Yeah, no,
He's like,
well, I
she's
mean,
a
maybe
brilliant transcriber of their terrible pathology.
that's right. That's
I mean,
exactly that actually I think is the basis of our conversation this afternoon. Let me say a couple more things about you. You are the director of the Ruth Stone Foundation up in Vermont. And this, from what I understand, is a very interesting kind of poetry in the woods seminar, learning immersion. It's also kind of like a museum of your grandma's home, right? Where she wrote most of her poems. Because is that right? And Ruth Stone is a very important American poet, 20th century. And Bianca is living this legacy. And in fact, you've recently been named the poet laureate of the state of Vermont. So congratulations on
thank
that.
you.
That's quite something.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So what is the Ruth Stone Foundation briefly, if you don't mind telling us about it?
Well, we changed the name to Roostone House because I I had this idea that that foundations have money that they give to other people, and we don't have any money. But in any case, the Roostone House is a nonprofit literary organization. So it started with the house because when she died, she left it in trust to me and to use for the furthering of poetry and the literary arts. So it was very open-ended. And so much had happened at that house in terms of her writing and her career and all her coterie that assembled there, and just a very bohemian hippie mecca in Vermont for a long time. And uh it had a lot of rich history around poetry and the arts, and she had a letterpress machine and did a lot of book art stuff. So, but the house was in terrible shape, and it's taken a long time to just save the house. So a lot of when you said museum, like a lot of it was sort of saving her house as like a object, right? But I also at the same time don't want a static object relic to the dead, I want it to be a living thing that's really making stuff, because I think that was really at the core of what what she wanted and what we were wanting to do. Um, so we have been over the years, I moved out of New York City to Vermont to do it full time. And over the years, we've been really expanding and developing and honing the programming and the vision for what it is we're doing. And it's really gone beyond the house itself. Yes, we have a physical property and it's a destination. I like to think of like the Black Mountain Poets and things like that. Like that was a place, and a lot of different people were coming there from a lot of different professions and occupations and interests. And I loved that. And I want that vibe. But we also have lots of online programming. We have a literary journal. I do the Odin Psyche podcast. So we're just expanding outward a lot from the physical property, but yeah, it's both. And it's all from the place of poetry. So I am really interested, as you know, in poetry and the psyche and consciousness and its psychoanalysis and philosophy. And so but it's all through the lens of poetry. And so I love the whole philosophy of the enterprise is moving in that direction. But like my husband's really into gaming too. And so he's
Hmm.
like developed this whole like D&D element to it. So yeah, we're cross-pollinating with different sects. And it's really fun because it's all unfolding right now. And my vision, it's not to like beat this to death, but my vision is to make a school and have it be like an MFA low residency alternative, maybe someday accredited, but for now, like a place to do the work, because so many people are dissatisfied with their MFA experiences in the institution, and that's why places like the Roostone House pop up to to do this work, like you and I are doing.
Wow. So I'll have to check it out sometime. I love Vermont so much.
You've got
Uh,
to come.
yeah, I definitely will. So so listen, everybody. Today we wanted to try to Bianca and I have had like this very epic exchange, just preparing to approach the topic that we want to talk about today. Epic in the sense that we feel, or I feel, I think you agree, that like philosophy, um, and then we'll talk about psychoanalysis later, but philosophy and poetry, according to Plato, of course, famously have an old quarrel. And the question is sort of why, right? Like, what is scandalous about poetry? What is scandalous about poets? Um, and
I mean,
so you've been thinking about this, Bianca, and I've kind of tried to um, compel you to think about it further. It is interesting, though. I have my own kind of view on it. I'm very much influenced by Alain Badiou, who is one of my mentors in philosophy. I studied with him for many years.
okay.
And like he famously gives these seminars every year on poetry and philosophy, and he's probably the most like lucid um philosopher to talk about poetry, and he actually reads like super widely in poetry. uh
I love him already, even though I read him for the first time 2 days ago.
yeah, yeah, so he has a very peculiar, let's say very singular or maybe even idiosyncratic way of getting at it. He is a Platonist, first of all.
Okay.
But I mean, I think that one of the things that I wanted to get your take on is this idea of how philosophy, maybe we could start putting aside some kind of conversation about what Plato meant by that. We can get to that in a moment, the exegesis, etc. What about for you though? Like, how do you think about your vocation as a poet and the the question of philosophy itself? How does that work for you? Like, because I know that you're super interested in consciousness and these kind of like psychological theories, etc. But how do you come at philosophy proper? Like, this question of like the truth, right? Like poetry as a, I don't know, like a font of the truth. Like maybe that's one more precise way to ask this. How do poets get at the truth? Do poets get at the truth? Is truth something that is like too grandiose to even like claim that that's what you're pursuing? Is that like too over the top for you?
I don't think so. I'm at a point in my life where when somebody asks me, "What do you write poems about?" I'm like, "Well, I'm trying to figure out the truth of existence, or that's unfigure outable," and I know that.
Right.
Um, I, I- but that's not, modern poetry isn't always aware of its pursuit of truth. It's a really interesting phenomenon that all the people that Badiou touches on, that the Phillips essay touches on, lots of people touches on, that like the interesting thing about poets is they're not even always aware of the fact that they're not only pursuing truth but stumbling upon truths. There's a sort of interesting compelled.
Why is that? Why are they not aware of it?
I don't know. I mean, because I feel like my intuition is because the unconscious is so wrapped up with how poetry works. But even I didn't even use the word unconscious till I started being in therapy, right? So and then reading about therapy. I hadn't really even made, isn't that insane that I hadn't even made the connection that to talk about the unconscious as being a phenomenon in poetry. But in terms of trying to access truths, I think even though poets maybe don't talk about their poetry as trying to find truths all the time, they also have this intuitive sense that that is what they're doing, because um, poetry has this way of coming to epiphanies, and it has ways of beauty and depth. Truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That's all ye need to know. I mean, that's sort of it built into poets, and that's a very
So,
romantic,
so how
but
do you know? How do you know that a poem has achieved something like that? Like, what's your criteria? I feel like that's what the philosopher would ask, what's your criteria? Because kind of going back to Plato, like Plato's point against the Protagoras is the idea that, yeah, like, the poet could define truth as
The
connecting to the
Yeah,
sensibility of the reader, and
right.
then boom, all right, job done. But then Plato would say, well, actually, no, that's actually, you haven't really touched truth there.
Well, isn't there too this thing that Badu comes up against, that once you arrive at a truth, there's something of the what did he put it, like the weakness of the real or something,
Mm,
like that to come knowingly to a truth and say this is a truth belies another truth at the same time, and doesn't allow for contradiction in some ways, maybe. Because in this, I it's really an interesting part of poetry that it doesn't seem to set out to find a truth. I think too of myth here, right? There's like myths, I think of like Ovid's Metamorphosis and things, and these stories in poems that have truths encoded in them, but there's seemingly stories that aren't truths, right? Like, what is this truth here? We have to work as readers and thinkers to constantly, over time,
mm,
glean truths from them. So in that way, imagine this, right? To say this is my truth, it would, almost like, maybe even like the sophist idea, right? The like, here's my truth that I'm arguing, wouldn't leave room for the reader to make truth too with them. And I feel like poetry is so dependent on the relational aspect of the reader and poet and poem, that it it sets up an experience to stumble upon truth on one's own. And we could even be tapping into right now how psychoanalysis actually works, which is that you can't tell somebody their truth. You can't tell somebody you have an Oedipal conflict, honey. That's all it is. It's like you could, and that could be like, oh yeah, I really see that, but it wouldn't make any difference in my like affects and my like
mm.
suffering.
Yeah,
I have to go on a journey to
yeah,
get there, and it involves so much language, but it also involves silence. It also involves like containment. It involves all this other embodiment and work that and then in the end you're like, I don't even know what was that.
mm,
I couldn't even point to that truth, but I can glean all these truths and talk about them later. I have these strange little moments of like, oh my God, like I feel this profound change in me that is a truth about existence and that other people have shared too. And I see these overlaps with other people's experiences. So I know it's a truth. So I know it's a
right,
shared truth.
right. How do you know when I mean, I guess I asked you a moment ago, how do you know when you, as a writer, are sort of tapping into that? Like, that's actually one question I had for you as a poet.
Mm,
How do you know when a poem is done? I feel like a lot of people that have never pursued poetry in a serious way probably have little understanding about the process of writing a poem. Um,
mhm.
Perhaps it would be useful for you to describe that for yourself, but also maybe in general, because perhaps then we could sort of see how this question of like one's possible touching of truth. Because on the other hand, I don't think that there's like a historical limitation probably in our time for any poet, such that there may be like sort of fundamental limits about what they can say regarding the truth of our time, even though they may be kind of trying to grasp something higher. They might be trying to touch this Hegelian idea of the whole truth of a social order, of the totality, or something like that. But they're only going to get at like shards of it or pieces of it. But even that little piece they may touch could actually be extremely transformative for the reader, right? So, what's the process of? Let's start with like writing a poem. Could you break that down, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, that long poem I sent you that mentions Hegel's whole,
Yeah.
infinite whole. um, started off as a sort of a reaction to a personal experience, which I deliberately knew I was retelling an experience and that I had license to lie a little bit about it. I always think of this poem when I think about lying in poetry. Yeah, but nevertheless, it was an experience of, um, I hate to even talk about the reality that the real thing that happened in my life that led to the poem, but it's true that that's what happens. Right. So we have these experiences in our life that for some reason, when you're a poet, you get better and better at tapping into which experiences are sort of more significant than others. And you're not even sure why. It's kind of like a dream, but you kind of know that something about that dream was important. Um, and you're like, why am I writing about this? Or why is this thing haunting me? I have to write about it. But like this experience was, I was supposed to be at a reading. It was on the other side of a mountain. It was a snowstorm. Um, and I, almost died getting there. So that was the experience, and I started writing about it, and that just took me to so many different places, and I didn't know where it was going to end up. And that's a unique poem too, because some poems will unfold fairly whole, which is a very special kind of poem for a lot of people. Maybe they change a few little things, but like sometimes the mind just makes something happen. You're like, you barely even remember writing it. You just remember the instigation of something kind of important. And you weave all these ideas together and you're good at following your mind and you're in a kind of flow state. Other processes are um, similar, but a little more laborious, which is that certain thoughts arise even if it's just a word, that have a certain power to them, that feel like they contain more than the thought. And that's really interesting. And two, I think of dream, I have this phenomenon, and it's usually in the moments of waking where a line will come to me. And it's a weird kind of dream to dream a line of thought, to dream a line of language. It's not visual, it's a thought, but it's a contained line. And you're like, "Oh my god, I've been given this gift from my unconscious or, from something else. Something put something together." And then you have this thing to work with and you go from there. And then um it's so much spontaneity and unpredictability, and yet some part of you is following something, is on a kind of investigation and putting a lot of things together, and some things don't work. Some things feel like you're trying too hard or the ego is getting into it, or like you're trying to sound like too beautiful and you're not, you know, you're not in conversation with your mind as much as you'd like to be. But then there's all this editing work to sort of look at what you have and try and take away what's not needed. And then sometimes the poem will emerge out of the chaos of a bunch of writing.
Can you add, or do you add multiple singular epiphanies to a particular poem? So for example, you have woken up with a phrase, and then a couple months later you woke up with another phrase, and then you say, hey, I'm going to incorporate that back in because it's somehow related. Does that work, or is each poem more to be understood as this kind of singular expression of something almost momentary for you? Like, how, do you see what I'm saying?
I do, and I love this question because it's hard. It's hard to have several epiphanies, even though they're not maybe what other people would see as epiphanies, but like important ideas. God, even the word idea is complicated, but um, in a poem, and yet at the same time, there maybe this word multiplicity, maybe there's this like multifarious aspect to different angles of the epiphany, maybe, or um one would be hard put to say this is what this poem is about, this one idea, this one epiphany. The epiphany itself is contains multiple um truths. I mean, I might even say that.
Wow. I mean, Is that effect something that is like, is there a typical feeling that you have after you have completed a poem that you feel good about? And how would you characterize that feeling? Like, is that a feeling of catharsis? Like, oh man, what a relief. I had to get that thing out. Now I'm like shed a skin, you know? Or is
Nothing.
it
Yeah.
is it something else? What is that feeling?
It's really not one, every poem is a little bit different, but I will say that, like, writing a poem and printing it out and going and getting it out of the printer is a very particular thrill that is almost like why why one writes. It feels so good to have written something and to go look at it, and it's strange. I mean, that's when you know it's good. It's almost unfamiliar, yet you're like, "I made this. I made this." And, what feels even better and see, the poet doesn't know always if it's great or not. I feel like this is great. I wrote such this is like the poem every poet's chasing the greatest poem they've ever written. They wanna write that incredible, like, breakthrough poem that's not like the other poems. Um, and the test, then the next day after writing it, you look at it and you're like, "Oh my god, this is sentimental and disgusting, and I hate it," and you rip it in a million pieces, and it's done, and then this horrible feeling of, like, I don't know myself, I don't know my own writing, maybe everything I've written is terrible, like, I wanna kill myself, and that's real. But then you come back to, "Okay, I have to have faith in the project and remember that one must write many flawed poems." But the test for a great poem is really sharing it with another person.
Yeah.
Now, I'm my husband's lackadaisical reaction to a new poem, like, sends me into a rage. It's hard in marriage, but to take it to a
I'd probably
read.
say it was good, but you're like, "But why didn't you say it's great?"
Yeah,
Like, what's
wait, no,
wrong?
no, it's really good. Okay, well, what I really hate is he'll start
Yeah.
critiquing first and foremost before praising. I don't want a poem that, it's like going to workshop. It sucks, but you're in workshop to get workshopped and become a better poet, but really you feel like you're in workshop to get praised. So you show up to workshop with your poem and everybody starts critiquing it and you're like, I just want everyone to love it. Come on. Which totally happens sometimes. And everyone's like rallying around your poem and it's great. But to take it to a reading and see people's reactions, to take it to a trusted friend who you read poems to and see their reaction. I think of Rilke reading, all his elegies when they were finished to, the the princess of Duino Castle and her just sobbing. And, that's what you want. You want, but part of you knows, and then part of you doesn't know. So you need to see people's reactions, and that's a delight. And
So, okay. So on the other side of the equation, when you read a poem that moves you, and I think it would be helpful, Bianca, for the benefit of our listeners, if you don't mind, um, to maybe share a couple names of contemporary poets that you are moved by, particularly on this question that I'm asking regarding like truth, of however you then define it, right? So like you're reading a poem, um, whether you know the poet or not. That's the other weird thing about poets of your stature or whatever. It's like you happen to know many poets,
Mhm.
because I feel like it's funny that it must be funny to read the personal poems of somebody that you know in a certain way. But anyways, putting that aside,
Oh, but it's great.
how do you know that you've read a poem? Here's my question. How do you know that you've read a poem that's like, they hit it. They hit something. What does that look
That's
like?
that looks great. As a reader of poetry, and people who don't read poetry don't know this. I mean, and when I say don't read poetry, I mean they think, "Oh, I don't like poetry because I read this poem and I didn't like it." you find the poetry you like. That's the fun of it. And when you find the poets and poetry, and you're always looking for it, and it's like rare. It's really rare to be great and to have find poets you can really love. And for me anyway, some people are more generous readers, but there's this immediacy that you feel that I feel when I read a poem that's working and is great. I feel completely let into the poem. That's some poems, they just you don't feel anything. You don't you're it's like you can see it for its value, like it's intelligence, its knowledge of how poetry works, its form on the page, it's checked all the boxes. But if it's not doing something to me, it's not a poem, or it's not a poem I wanna read. And sometimes you can not understand a poem at one time in your life, and then, I didn't get Ashbery when I was 17, but when I was in grad school and I had a great teacher who showed me how to read Ashbery, I suddenly it just exploded in me and I
Yeah.
loved it, so
That's a great point. That's a great point.
it
The
is,
same with, like, Wallace Stevens. It's like,
oh, totally.
you can come at him and be like, "What is this kind of, like, flat, sort of it's like seemingly boring."
He's so controlled.
It's like, yeah, it's, like, too controlled. I don't get it. Okay, I can see that there's some profound kind of claims going on that are philosophical claims in many ways, but, like, I don't have any feeling. Like, I'm not
Right.
actually. So that's interesting. What you're kinda saying is that's a didactic point. So somebody can teach you how to feel a poet.
I mean, I hate to say it's feeling alone because it's but it's something, it is about feeling. A lot of the times you don't know what's happening to you, but something is happening to you. And you can tell, like I can tell when my poems are working on people because I can see it in their face. They look like a little bit like they're drowning. They look a little bit afraid. And like two people like crying is always a good sign. Laughing is always a good sign. So maybe, yeah, maybe feelings are important here. I mean, we're sort of, I don't want to sentimentalize it, but yeah, I mean, um, but then also there's the epiphany too, like, oh, you've gleaned a truth, and it takes you, when people have to go think and be alone after reading a poem, that's what we want. This idea that poetry expands consciousness is true. Poetry, if your consciousness is being expanded, it's strange, but you like it. It's a real, and it's a guide. It's like you look to poetry for help. Um, just you become like somebody who needs it, even if you hate it a lot of the time.
So could you say a couple poets that you are into these days, maybe? If you don't mind, just a few for folks to kind of, maybe take notes and, um, maybe get some recommendations, that kinda thing.
Absolutely. Two of my favorite poets are Franz Wright and Larry Levis, and I read them a lot. And living poets include Dara Barwa Dixon, who used to be Dara Wire. Anne Carson is incredible, and she's got a wide range of kinds of poetry essay, I'd say. Um, and Rainer Maria Rilke has been a late in life for me poet, but a poet I just love so much and find so much inspiration from, and you can really go deep with him into a lot of different uh historical contexts to his whole trajectory. So he's a really fun poet to get into. Um and Lucille Clifton, I'd sent you one of her dream poems. Uh yeah, those are, and I mean John Ashbery too. I mean the New York School was very important to me for a long time.
Thank you for that.
And Ruth Stone, I should add too. You should definitely read Ruth Stone. Yeah.
I want to come back to like your own style and your own practice of writing, but I also wanted to incorporate, I think might be a good time to do it, this question that we initially kind of got connected around, which is the role of psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in a certain way because, I mean, well, it's interesting on a few levels, right? I guess I can tell you why I see it as interesting, and then I'd like for you to jump in.
Yeah.
Like, the first reason is psychoanalysis is not practiced too much in America, unfortunately, largely having to do with like privatized health insurance and people don't have access to it.
Oh, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. So there's that. Whereas like even in like the 70s and before, psychoanalysis was kind of like one of the predominant forms of therapy. And I mean, it was still very exclusive, like working class people still didn't have access to it, that kind of thing. But anyways, I mean, as I've mentioned on the show before, if anyone listening is interested in gaining very affordable access to psychoanalysis, here's a great way to do that. If you live near a college town where there is a psychoanalytic set of like students that are becoming professional psychoanalysts, they actually require finding patients and they cannot really charge them.
Mm.
So that's one idea. And then there's a lot of online things that are very affordable and will work on your income. What's called sliding scale. But what is, I guess, let's start this by asking, psychoanalysis itself is like a philosophy, right? It's also like, right? It's like a one can develop a kind of distinct psychoanalytic theory of poetry. And I know that you've been thinking a lot about that. So let's start actually, maybe if we could, from that point of view, and then I'll get into like the therapeutic and the other stuff. But like, it seems that psychoanalysis has become, and you know, whether it's Freud, whether it's Jung, whether it's Lacan, whether it's Wilfred Bion, like that's all cool. We can talk about their specific, but like maybe you've been thinking about it for a while. Have you developed like a kind of idea as to why psychoanalysis is sort of vital for poetry? And why is that?
I don't know if it's necessarily vital for poetry, but it has showed me so much about how to talk about the opportunity that one has in poetry that is overlooked by a lot of new writers today. So in my teaching, for example, um, right. So it's important to poetry because it's important to us as humans. Um, but it also has shown me so much about what poetry does and how, Freud said it himself, all the poets, it's so easy for them. The analyst has to slog through to get at the truths in the psyche. Um, and yet at the same time, I think one problem with writing is that we end up having this very small idea of our own experience, our own autobiographical experience, the way our history has unfolded, the way memory works, our relations to other people, and most importantly, our self, our like ego self, our like how we perceive who we are. Now, the poem is such a unique literary device because it's not a here's the thing that I've just come to. It's not a fucking genre. Somebody invented genre at some point, but poetry has always been. And poetry has this weird phenomenon of being both not fiction and nonfiction and neither. It's also song. So we all know that the contemporary poem, or the modern poem, I might say, is concerned with the autobiographical experience. And it has this um, it has this I in it. Now, the I is also, people are like, oh no, this navel gazing poem with the I. The I is the most sure way to get away from what you think the self is. The I is a mask, a persona. The I is a speaker. Now, what does that do? That enables you to talk as yourself and not yourself to other parts of yourself while being aware that you're being overheard by a reader. So it's this incredible way to um, investigate this psychical relation between self and other, and like I said, with our own internal world. So psychoanalysis has shown me this. Now, psychoanalysis, I mean, Adam Phillips's essay, Poetry and Psychoanalysis, I'm like, only a British analyst would write this, because he goes on and on about how all analysts can, if they agree on anything, it's that the poet is so important. I'm like, who thinks that here in America? Nobody. It's so sad. But they, historically, a lot of the British analysts knew, and the German analysts, and respectively, knew that poetry and philosophy had tapped into something, the unconscious, already. Now they're just formalizing it. Now you say that psychoanalysis is a philosophy. Well, they go saying it's a science, right? So there's that anxiety,
Right.
right? So now the tension between those three things is very interesting. And now the poet, in my little poem theory, kind of makes fun of this, is that the poet is indifferent to this tension. They don't care. They're bringing in psychoanalysis, they're bringing in science, they're happy with it all. But the other occupations have a lot of anxiety about the poetic and its importance to them. But they can't avoid it. It keeps coming up. I mean, even Badiou was saying, like, even Plato can't help but use this poetic imagery of the sun, use these myths in order to elucidate his ideas.
Mm.
And psychoanalysis, of course, with all its free association and work with fantasy and imagery and the rest of it, is at its best poetic, right?
Yeah. So, is there an argument to be made that a poet should keep a distance from a deep, deep immersion into the truths of psychoanalysis? Like, in the sense that if psychoanalysis kind of takes away the mystery, or sort of,
Mm,
like Lacan has this idea, and if you read a lot of Lacan, it does get, as we were talking earlier, like painstakingly complex, but also at moments you get these epiphanies of profound clarity.
mhm, mhm.
For
There's
you,
poetry, and yeah.
yeah, for you, are those moments of clarity when you're reading theory, philosophy, or psychoanalytic literature, are those ultimately very productive? Does that, like, I don't know, like,
That's been
fuel your desire, or could you actually be like, oh gosh, this is actually stripped me of something? Like, oh my gosh, the I was better off writing without knowing some of these things. Maybe that's a weird question, but I'm just
No,
curious.
it's a great question, Daniel. I went through so much anxiety about this in my analysis. It's not only that, but I had I mean, I think you said in your 10 things you learned about psychoanalysis that you ended up being able to talk in theory in psychoanalysis. For me, that was not the case. I was terrified of my research infecting my analysis and being a massive distraction from the work, which it was in a way, for sure. And ended up being like important to things we discovered about my anxiety about that, right? And my neurosis around that. So, but in terms of, and in my poetry, yes, I worried about it, but there was also the fact that I was going through an extremely intense therapy. I've been doing intensive short-term dynamic psychodynamic therapy, and so it's really intense, and I was having a hard time writing. I'm gonna say that I published my book in the first year of my therapy, but I had already started a lot of those poems. But still, I was going through such a massive change that it shook my writing. Of course it would. Of course my writing couldn't stay the same. But what did that mean? Who am I? Who am I without clinging to my tragedies, my traumas? How can I let go?
Mm,
How can I move on from
mm,
those things that I've been writing about for so long? That scared me.
yeah. Yeah, like Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, has this idea of um it's like this neologism, so it's like a made up word that he likes to make up words, um, called the centome, and it's meant to be a homophony of Saint Thomas Aquinas. And the idea is kind of like theoria in the sense that for some people, uh, at the end of analysis, they have this thing like the cure, like, okay, you're cured, It's kind of a cheap idea, like, oh, okay, great, see you later. But
Right.
but Lacan's point, right, is that no, actually, there's a dimension within the symptom that is kind of an incurable dimension. And so actually that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do psychoanalysis for life. But what Lacan would say is actually that for many, you would need like some kind of artistic avenue for sublimating that or managing that. And of course, this is in the later period of Lacan's teaching where he turns to James Joyce and he diagnoses James Joyce as a psychotic who plugged the hole of this super problematic relationship that he had to his father, precisely by writing. And so the question then for me was sort of I don't know, maybe it's a weird question, but it's like, okay, well, what if you solve that hole and then can you still productively write? And that's because that's kind of what you're saying right now. And that's a weird thing to think about, which is like, um, and for people that are poets, maybe they're listening to this and saying, well, why would I do psychoanalysis if it's going to harm my writing?
I can't I couldn't I When I arrived in that office, I was unable to find any joy in reading and writing anymore, So it's like I couldn't not go. You know, I have to say that being in therapy has been the most exciting and terrifying experience of my entire life. I would never I mean, the fact that I ended up and did it and was there and, it's so sad and serendipitous that we're talking right now because I am at I know I'm at the end of my therapy. God, I'm let's like burst into tears right now. Um, and I know I'm at I just know it. I know because I had this we kept coming to things. We kept having epiphanies, we kept having breakthroughs, and it was a long, hard road. And but we came to something, the ending is long and it's never I'm not ending. My unconscious isn't ending. My work isn't ending, but something that I went to see him for is ending. And it's like if I'd ended any sooner, it would have been a much more of an issue, right? I had moments where I was like, I could leave and still have gotten a lot out of this. But part of me was new. I wasn't because I hadn't arrived. I knew I hadn't arrived somewhere. And now that I've arrived somewhere, it's like everything has changed. The fact that I've changed this much, this profoundly it's so real. I can't I my heart goes out to people who have failed analyses because to have a successful one feels like this and you step into your life. But it's like the moment I step into my life, it's not that my problems go away or sadness goes away necessarily, but it's just not the same anymore. And so much has opened up to me. I'm writing, I know my next book is gonna be the best book I've ever fucking written, you know? I know that because I'm so grounded in knowing myself, right? All this, we haven't even gotten into the unknowing, but, like, all this work of poetry and psychoanalysis involves a lot of letting go of what you think you know, and being in a state of, when Bion talks about it, you know, he uses Keats's idea of negative capability. Being, you know, what Keats said in his letter, "Oh, what goes into making a man of achievement like Shakespeare? Being able to be in great uncertainty and doubt,
Mm,
and being able to write in that space, and
mm,
put that space into the work itself so that the reader can be in it too."
mm,
But ironically, the maxim, "Know thyself," is at the other side of that. If I all that uncertainty and doubt and unknowing what I thought I knew about myself in psychoanalysis has brought me to this place of knowing myself. And here's the other thing about the poetry though, is almost like my poetry, it's not almost like, it is like my poetry knew more than I did all along, and it still does. And I would want it that way because it's as if somehow being a poet and the machine of poetry that you make, it's like you're unconscious. It's like consciousness on the page. It's you make it on the page, and it contains an unconscious in the poem. You're unconscious and some larger unconscious. And so it knows and it doesn't know. It knows so much more. I went off on a tangent, but like, yeah. I
yeah.
what I guess to like just put a bow on it is like, yes, I was scared and I should have been scared, but about my poetry at losing it. But I wouldn't trade. I knew I had to do the work or I was gonna die. And like now, never think you're gonna lose your poetry by doing this work. This is the work. This is the work. This is the only reason we're on this planet. Psychoanalysis formalized it.
Mm,
It's still like so imperfect. And my God, if you can get a good analyst, you're so lucky. But
yeah. So how do you think about this from the standpoint of is it like the lifting of barriers? Is it the like what was transcended? I mean, not I know it's like a process and it's not complete or nor is it final, but speaking for myself, one of the interesting things about analysis, and I'm not going to get personal, I'm just going to say this like very generally,
okay.
is that you know they have this idea of the fundamental fantasy, and one of the things is that you go in with a kind of confidence, maybe even like a zeal that you kind of know what your problems are.
I love this. Yeah.
And anyways, yeah, and
You're like, I'm
then
gonna go, yeah.
you become like pretty genuinely surprised through both the work of your analyst at shifting that site of attention to something else. At least for me, it was. I
Mhm,
mean, that would
mhm.
be interesting actually if somebody went into analysis and they're like, what I thought was my primary issue was my primary issue. I don't think that's like possible. That's like transitive, like the omnipotence, you know, of
Right,
like
right.
I don't think that's real. I don't think that's
Well
real.
well, isn't
You know what
that
I mean?
the sort of issue with the matheme and the sort of
Totally.
coming in with the idea, the original idea that then you trace, what would psychoanalysis
Well,
look
that
like with that?
that's actually why Badiou said that Plato banishes the poets because the poets are concerned with the symptom of the polis. They're not concerned with the idea. And therefore,
Hmm.
they need to be kind of kept on the margins of society and not empowered precisely because uh like the transmission of truths, the truths that we share in common at a social level, like poets actually are meant to speak to the points of disruption in those truths, not to their full achievement, not to their full blossoming or their full, I don't know, realization in society. This goes back to this idea of truth as totality, which then becomes even more complex in the modern
It
period,
just
precisely.
reminds me the totality is like just every the truth of totality, I mean, Like there's one truth?
No, it's not that there's one truth. It's rather that the apprehension of a truth can be realized in a non-contradictory way. Like, it's subject that the resolution between my subjective experience of the truth and its objective ontological existence happens in a total way. That kind of resolution
Mm.
is fully possible. That's kind of the idea of totality.
I feel
And
like
this is
that's
kind of
death.
that's the Hegelian idea of, well, of the absolute. And because Hegel basically has this notion that, yeah, like the social order can achieve something like the imminent absolute realization. And Plato would submit to something quite similar, but it's not a kind of unitary truth. It's more like Badiou talks about it, and because he himself is a Platonist, as sites or situations where there are a multiplicity of truths. The question for the subject, right, that psychoanalysis brings to the table, because Badiou calls, you know what he calls psychoanalysis? He
What?
calls psychoanalysis an anti-philosophy.
Interesting.
So the psychoanalyst and the poet are not really interested in truth qua non-contradictory totality, etc., right? They're interested
Right, right.
in this other side of truth,
The
which is
individual truth.
they're interested in the side of truth which is half said. So Lacan
Mm,
says the
mm,
human, for the what he calls the speaking being, um, because we are governed by the unconscious, there's not a fullness that can be uttered in language
right,
of the truth of something.
right,
And so therefore it has this kind of partial quality.
right.
I feel that the poet maybe comes in at that point of that, and that partial quality could then be qualified as kind of like this residue, this kind of drive, this libidinal, the body, like
Right,
this
right.
hangover of desire, enjoyment, and so on. That all disturbs Plato's clean transmission, right?
It's so true. Yeah.
Right. Now, what you're saying is really interesting, which is almost like a provocation to other poets to do the work of therapy. As a side point, Bianca, it's quite interesting because there's a lot of research that argues at a political level, in the sexual revolution of the 1960s, therapy became a kind of replacement for politics. And I've always been um, sensitive to that argument. In other words, um, I don't know if you've read like Philip Reif's Triumph of the Therapeutic. It's this idea that Freud kind of concocts a system for subjectivity to relativize their own social ills
Mm,
as purely subjectivist. And so this is kind of like an anti-psychoanalytic point of view. Part of the problem with that is that when you have a therapeutic society, some people have argued that like actual social antagonisms that are the true roots of our psychical woes get unaddressed. They get unaddressed. And I don't know what you think about that. It's a slight tangent, but I think
well,
what I'm trying to say is
yeah.
this. I'm trying to say I think it's healthy to have a bit of a kind of agonistic relationship to the therapeutic discourse, because it's not perfect and it's very hit or miss,
Yep.
and it's like a access problem. It's like class, poverty. The people that need therapy don't get it, stuff like that,
I
right?
mean, it's a
You know,
Herculean effort. It's a complete
the
luck of
time
the
that it
draw
takes.
that to find a therapist that I mean, also when you're in like, a mentally ill person like myself, it was took every ounce of, and years in order to get it together to, crawl in, and it was like but you know, when Plato says the measure of the political principle is precisely the exclusion of the poem, it's like, I mean, that the poem could be that threatening to the political, and to the city and to the mass, the larger society. That's kind of I feel like when you're talking when in terms of a psychoanalytical society, I mean, that just doesn't feel right because to me, and it's kind of a Jungian idea for sure, but like it's about the individual looking inward at their own shadow, at their own depths, and and becoming, and doing it to the till it's done. You've got to do it till it's done, and maybe you have to do it multiple times. But in a way, it's like Dante going down, his midlife crisis and going down into hell and back up. I mean, you do that journey. There's usually like one big one, right? And then lots of little ones that now you know the work. Now you know what it entails. But once you do that individual work, then I feel like that reflects in the city, that reflects in the
Yeah.
society, that reflects that. But that's what, and maybe Plato's right. Poets are always going to be marginalized. Historically, there was always like one poet in the tribe, that
Right.
spoke truths. It's like, it's not everybody can't do that. They can read the poetry. And I think poetry should be way more ingrained in our society and in
Mm.
our educational system, not as a genre, not as a unit. It should be something that we use in order to talk about exactly the issue here, contradictory truths. And if one goes to psychoanalysis, one comes out bearing ambiguities, I
Right.
mean, that's what you end up doing. You bear the conflict of love and hate, you know?
Right. Well, that's actually why, as a very committed socialist, you probably know the channel that you're on right now is very like Marxist oriented. And as a point of self-criticism, Marxism has historically become Lacan called Marxists like great savants, which means kind of like scientists. So like a lot of Marxists really think that they have the truth, right? And we know like what happened in various places when some socialist parties came to power. First of all, I mean, many great things happened, but I feel like actually it's very important for the left to actually have like a connection to poets, precisely because if Plato's right, maybe you could think about poets as keeping political theorists and philosophers more honest in a
Yeah,
certain way, you know?
right.
That is a sort of like a, like a tempering thing. And that's actually very interesting. This is a strange question that I wanted to ask you. I think it might be a good time to ask it. Is there a primary virtue for you as a poet? Like one of the things that Badiou, my great teacher, talks about is how um, we cultivate and we select like virtues that are pertinent for our time and for our situation. So therefore, like they're kind of subjective. So they're pertinent to our situation. And so for me, I've always thought like, yeah, there are certain virtues that are super central for me. Are there for you? Like, I don't know, maybe like, I don't know, courage, or is there something that elevates to something that's like, because a lot of philosophers will end up privileging certain virtues over others. Do poets do that? And do you do that?
That's, I haven't really put it that way to myself before. But I feel in my heart that I do, I do. I think now, having come through this incredible experience with my therapist, that I value truth about myself and being true to myself, and not, accepting the language of someone else as my truth, and that comes with knowing myself, right? So I want to, like, coming on this podcast, like, I had all this anxiety about having to understand everything that you understood, which would be impossible for me. And then I just kept coming back to, like, I have a faith in another beyond term. I have a faith in what I'm doing with my writing and my speaking, my language. Um, and I want to stay true to that, even though I don't know everything. I don't know if it's all right and wrong. I'm just, so I guess a certain amount of honesty towards myself, Now,
Honesty towards yourself, meaning honesty towards both capabilities, but also consistency about this
yeah,
staying true to something that challenges you as much as you want it to challenge your audience, right? So then
right.
what is that thing? What is that thing that you're staying honest to?
Fuck, I don't. Let's see.
Does that make sense? Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
What am I staying honest to? Um, I want to. I don't know what it made. The first thing it makes me think of is attention. Am I paying attention to the people around me? What's being said right now? Am I paying attention to myself? Right? I feel like there's this um no, I should be doing this, or I should be doing what someone else is doing, or getting distracted with um even just like fantasy of what might, what I want, what I desire. Or am I paying attention to what is real in my life? And in conversations with other people and in my writing, like, I don't want to, I just want to do the work. I want to do the work, and that takes paying attention. But it's been hard when you're lost in the web of your own trauma that's like made this mess of how you see the world, and the anxiety of what you think other people expect of you, right?
Hmm.
So I don't know. Yeah, the virtue of paying attention.
I like
Um,
that. I like that. I
yeah,
also like that point about reality
yeah.
because I think that this idea of the fetish as a kind of cover of reality that is born from, I mean, this whole concept of fetish is so important. I mean, Marx talks about how like the exchange relations in capitalism create this kind of web, right? That actually blocks our reality, right? That distorts our reality, right?
Mm,
At almost like a metaphysical level in social life. And so we can't see the true machinations of the system that we're ingrained in. But then
so true.
on this level that you're talking about, it's slightly different because it's the maybe it's like the truth of the eye in its
Mhm.
own singularity. And then Badiou has this beautiful idea of what he calls the unnameable, that the poet, um, that's the unnameable is simply, I think, one way to define that maybe is like the object that the poet is trying to um, generate towards or work towards in their poetry, which is something kind of uh, something that is maybe you could say beyond the symptom that the poet is concerned with, right? So in that sense, that notion of reality as has also an ethical duty in this sense, and this is actually where the poet has a political role, precisely because the poet, and I think we see this in a lot of poets historically, even though they're not statesmen, they still
Right,
have certain political power precisely because they are grounded. They see things. They're not afraid to say things. They're not as they're not going to be swayed by public opinion. They're not going to be swayed by fashions,
right.
right? They're not going to be swayed by these kind of, because like maybe Plato was kind of wrong, like because he kind of called poets kind of opportunists.
Yeah,
But
it's
what if they're
not
not?
like the sophist. It's not somebody trying to sell you something.
Some do, maybe.
Well, it's yes, totally.
Of course.
And I can see right through them.
Yeah, you can see through them, but I mean that's actually what I found noble. That's like the noble calling of a poet. And there's
Yeah.
some that elevate to that level, and they do become political figures.
Mhm.
And they don't really have to have like a grand theory of politics.
Probably better not to.
What do you mean by that?
I don't know. I mean, to take political sides, I guess. But then one
Well, see,
has
but
to
that
one.
worries me though.
I
That
know
worries
that
me
worries me
though.
too, right when I said it. I'm not
Well,
gonna
yeah,
take
no, I mean,
sides.
let's talk about this. Like, what does that
Oh,
look like? Because I do think you're right that they need to avoid like an instrumentalized.
well, I think it's
Uh,
very yeah. What I just mean that, like, it's not that they don't take sides. But once you start calling yourself a political poet and start naming all the reasons why you're a political poet, it takes something out of the mystery and the possibility of the poem, right? Um, but then I think of things like, oh, it's very telling that Republicans never have poets read at the inauguration and things like that. There's this certain sides embrace the poet more than others, and of
Yeah.
course, the poet's going to go towards the side that values the things that they value in terms of how they see um, what's important in the world, what's important in being.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I'm thinking of, like, Osip Mandelstam, who was the poet of the Bolsheviks of 1917, and, he he really wrote in a tragic mode about it precisely because he lived through, like, what happened with Stalin and everything,
Right.
but he always maintained this fidelity to an object that was collectively trying to be constructed out of it, that never fully faded, right? That never fully faded in his lifetime. I think he died in, like, the 1930s. Um, so I do think that you can have a poet who has political commitments that are not somehow going to degrade their
Right.
project. You know what I'm
No,
saying?
of course not. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, this is super interesting that we've gone down this thing of the virtues and the ethical calling of the poet. Um, do you, I guess, are there poets that elevate to that stature for you? Like, was John Ashbery like that? Because Christopher Nealon has this incredible essay about John Ashbery from a Marxist point of view, where he argues that actually you can read pretty much the entirety of John Ashbery's work as a kind of latent commentary on the crises of neoliberal capitalism,
I love that.
and that he's trying to concoct an aesthetic, a way of life that is at a remove or a distance from the crises of our system, of our politics and economics. Because, I mean, if you think about it, in our generation, we've just had one crisis after another, right? And if you read Ashbery, um, part of what I find so interesting about him is this kind of detached, Walt Whitman-esque um, space that he enters into, which is almost like permits the reader to have a relief from the day-to-day chaos and turbulence of our world. While he's also in it, of course. He's also in it, but he's in it in a very playful way,
Mhm,
in a
mhm.
way which is very tolerable. He
Yeah.
makes it very tolerable, and he makes it actually sometimes you could say enjoyable. But there's also a certain detached element. So I'm just curious, like, how would you
John
characterize
Yeah.
Ashbery as one example and maybe somebody else on this political level?
I'm scared to answer this question, but I will say that knowing John when he was alive, that he would never say that that was what his poems were doing ever. And I remember one time he was like, "Yeah, this one guy wrote this whole paper, and I guess this poem's about my mother's vagina." And we all laughed because it was like somebody had put a lot of effort into psychoanalyzing this poem, and he was like, that's not what it's about. But like one again, it comes back to this idea of the poet and their unconscious at work and being in a historical context, which is very important in a poet's life. They're not in a vacuum at all. Art reflects the society, it reflects the climate, it reflects the people's feelings, and it reflects it on a very individual through an individual gaze. But two, it has this insane adherence to the unconscious that is built in many ways through the unconscious is the poem behind the poem. And so of course it always reflects these political um instances, and it's the job later of critics and thinkers to plumb those depths, not the poet. In a way, there's this ancient idea that the Greeks knew, that the poets had a sort of and D.H. Lawrence says, not I, but the wind blows through me. that there it's just like this idea of being a little bit of a vessel, like things go through you that you don't, and yes, the wind, nature, the divine, the unseeable, but also I would argue the political climate, the people, the yes, the city, the collective. Wow, that's I've never thought that before, but it's totally true. Right? So,
Well,
but
you are now the poet laureate of a
of a
state
state,
of a
yeah.
state. It's a concrete place.
Exactly, and our Republican governor will be installing me very soon, um, and I did have this moment when I became poet laureate of Vermont where I was like, "Oh my god," I felt like a statesperson all of a sudden. I was like, I felt this rise of, like, opportunity to, like, make a difference,
Yeah.
and to talk to people on that level, and I think many po not some poets are just they just don't wanna be involved in that world directly. They want to be they're very private, right? And they let their poems do all that work. Other poets are very active and out there, and they're marching on the front lines, or they're doing the work of being part of the community more in a more involved way. I'm, like, in between the 2, right? So and that's how I'd like it. And yeah, some poets are very overtly political, and some are more quiet and subtle about it.
Yeah, or some have a kind of something moral to teach merely by their craft. And
Right.
so that's the thing that interests me, is this kind of, like, even I would say, like, Gary Snyder, who was like a part of the kind of counterculture revolution in the 60s and 70s, was never very, like, forwardly political, but he has certain, like, clear, like, ethical compass.
Yes, of course.
That
And
really interests me. Yeah.
well, it's when I'm workshopping students' poems and stuff and I'm seeing all this, oh my god, well, this is clearly a reaction to global warming, like, it's just pervasive, or like the tragedy in Gaza, and when Trump was president, it was just like, ugh, it was reflected in everybody's poems. They couldn't not react to it.
So this has been such an amazing conversation. I want to actually invite you to read a poem of yours, if you would be so willing, and um, your choice. Although the ones you shared with me are all really, really exciting. I especially appreciate the one that you're. Was it the Black House?
Yeah, that's a whole chapbook.
Yeah, and that's forthcoming.
No, it came out, but it's all sold out.
Ah, okay, okay, okay.
But it's I'll try to I'm gonna try to work it into its own book. I wanna write about my analysis. The problem is obvious, right? I don't wanna talk about my personal stuff and that I went through in analysis, but I also wanna talk about my analysis, so it's a real conundrum, and I wanna write it in poem, and I don't wanna write it as a poem, so I'm form is the work here. Anyway,
Understood.
that's just, like,
Yeah,
about the Black House, which is yeah.
yeah, and I feel like this thing we were talking about before is so interesting, about how the poet's object is kind of like the symptom, but the symptom is not knowledge, right? But this is what Beju says. It's not knowledge. He says it's actually the real. And the real as a form of undeniable reality that is kind of mutually shared. So it's intersubjective. And I think that that's such a good definition of sort of what poets are aiming at, ideally, in some ways, right? And that is so interesting, because it then grounds you back into this question of reality. And I feel like that's so important in these times, given all of the anxieties that people have, especially as a father, seeing my children with these anxieties of the future and of just like life on earth and all of these like fundamental, like collective existence, seems to me that poets have such a vital, like, social task in this world of ours.
Yeah.
Um, but could I invite you to read a poem? And would it be possible if you read um,
You want
Memory
me
Palace?
Oh, yeah, of course.
I really appreciate it. This is This one really struck me. So
Memory Palace. Every memory palace should have a wet basement with frozen pipes and mouse bones between the cracked foundation. Every memory palace should have my childhood basement at the dead end of Elm Street with its decaying beams and dirt floor, where we stored a mannequin named Greta, who scared us shitless every time we went to reset the hot water tank. Greta, purchased from Paquette's department store closing sale in 1999, the same store my feet were measured by those amazing people that used to be in the world, who knelt down in front of you like Magdalene with her wet hair on the hooves of Christ to press your big toe through the leather and tell you to walk around a little, see how it feels. Everything khaki and ketchup red, frosted glass, pastel floral. Santa Claus lived there at the top of the staircase, and I sat on him, suddenly aware of how grubby my winter coat was, and my nails, how crooked my gaze. Greta watched, flawless in her prime, from her corner in the newest sweater and pantyhose and pencil skirt, not knowing that later she would be purchased by us for $40, not knowing she would end up on the ground naked, dismembered, her boobs bared for no one but the spiders, the plumbers, her arm lying beside her and her hand with 3 missing fingers that were kicking around somewhere upstairs. I have no memory palace. I have tomato paste cans, bloated on a sagging plywood shelf. Memory, my botulism exhibit, my lockjaw, my declawed cat. Come, and you'll trip over a cement statue of a cement bag that got wet before it was even opened, all its creases preserved perfectly. When I look back, there's an axe in my head and a tarp laid over me. There's a white mask hanging on the wall with no eyes, just holes with more wall looking out. So angry it's frozen in a red smile, guarding what can neither see nor hear, let alone remember, let alone make a palace.
my gosh, thank you so much.
Yikes.
So yeah, so the imagery going on here is quite something. Talk about, if you would, like the process of this. Was this one of those poems that kind of came to you all at once, as you talked about earlier?
No, I didn't think I was gonna like follow through with this poem because it just seemed impossible to have to talk about this. I don't know why. I was thinking, sometimes I'll just write things thinking I'm not going to do anything with it, but I just write it anyway. And I was playing with the idea of a memory palace because I've been thinking so much about memory and how it works and apparently doesn't work, um, and also about the basement itself, which I think reflects the unconscious, as the idea of the unconscious. And so I had, a fairly narrative poem about a literal basement, and a literal uh, memory. So I think what I spent the most time on that changed a lot was the ending of the poem, the turn in the poem, which, memory, my botulism exhibit, my lockjaw. I was trying to work in ideas of like a failed Mormon food storage in our basement that was just like these old bloated cans, and just the terror of that place that just reflected the terror of my childhood. And this mask that came up in therapy in terms of just image, like things that come up in therapy that aren't real, that are images that are significant and speak to something. But it was a real thing. And the real mask pointed towards a real repressed memory. So it was very interesting, in that way, right?
Yeah,
So
that's incredible. Um, I notice in your work you're able to do some pretty profound, almost like confessionary, if that's the right word. And I was wondering if your immersion into psychoanalysis maybe has helped you in that, because I know there's like this cliche of like the young poet and they're like at their reading and they're very nervous, but that yet still they're doing like some kind of confessional, maybe it's not confessional poetry, but there's an element of a very deep revealing going on. And so perhaps that's actually one dimension of psychoanalysis that could help a poet, any poet, just in general. Not so much like as a performance, but actually to, yeah, I guess, yeah, in that self-knowledge, does that lead to a greater ease with revealing parts of yourself?
I don't know because I've always been more comfortable revealing things in poems than in therapy. For me, it was very hard to speak, and the transference was so strong that I was just sitting there in terror a lot of the time. And so, ironically, the opposite, right? So I couldn't speak, and I think it's when I was reading about um, Winnicott's emphasis on speaking nonsense without any meaning behind it, not free association in terms of free association hoping to find meaning, but just letting oneself be playful and nonsensical. Um, I was so afraid of not having meaning when I spoke that I couldn't speak at all, and I couldn't let that nonsense come out, and I couldn't free associate. I'm coming to a connection, I'm sure. Whereas in poetry, I always because you have this speaker that's not you, the I that's not the I, there's this veil of I should have thought of it that way from the beginning, you know? If I had brought my poetry self in there and I probably would have been better off. But that's not the way that my work went, it was the very opposite. So I needed to do that opposite work of um anti-poetical and then coming back to the poetry. I think the ease which I found is talking like I'm talking to you now. Like I'm more able to speak in conversation and
Mm,
speak my mind.
mm.
And in my poetry, I'm more free to maybe follow my images that come from the unconscious and seeing them as more as important and seeing more clearly the possibilities of the persona.
Wow. Wow. Um, is there another poem that you have in mind that might speak to some of the themes that we've been talking about this afternoon in terms of that you might want to read for us, perhaps? I'm just wondering, like something that might elucidate some of these kind of meteor themes that we've been grappling with. Does anything come to mind? Whether that be something you wrote or something written by another poet?
Yeah. Um, I'm sure. Well, I guess the Franz Wright poem. Let's see.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that'd be cool.
that would be
Please.
perfect. Actually, it's called "Out of Delusion," and it's from Wheeling Motel. Pretty sure. In blue branches, the moon feigning coma all morning, always fading and drifting away. A book one wrote decades ago now seems stranger than somebody else's. Of the slumbering hand, this change, ineluctable, cloud-like, I speak in the mask of the first person, not as myself, not in the glory of action, of experience when time and dying stop, but as anyone in the in-between hours, the hours alone or traveling or waking in a strange room or the moment when friends all fall silent and each gazes into his own past, his own end. That is what I meant, the way things look then. Music, silence, the word. I'd emulate these little candles, just lit for the newly dead. Enter the endless, the original words, which shine from behind and through words, and be through with them, through with all words. So desperately tired of the long, long flight from God. 1 hourglass of eventual cremation dust, thinking, get me out of here. Riding the subway, I glimpse myself in the seat next to mine, in the adjacent universe, one Uranus drooling but otherwise fine human hamster, attempting and repeatedly failing to pour cough syrup into a spoon, thinking, the sky is a river of souls, as everyone knows. Darkness and blizzards come from the future, and the road is long as the memory of a child, thinking, I could not bear to know what I do. No one knows no one like I do. Sparrow at the gates of heaven, or maggot at the gates of heaven, there I am with all the others from the 20th century of horror, and that is a beginning.
No one knows no one. That is so this is profound, and I want you to elaborate on this. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
help us out here. I mean, I
well,
have some premonition as to what's going on, but I think you've spent a lot more time with this than I have.
well, I love it's one of my favorite poems ever written, and I just feel like it's one of those perfect poems. Like he just hits the notes so well. And that's important for a poem. That's just it's got to hit it's like a sonic thing. It's just it's sound, it's music, it's and that's language. I you'd asked me in your email, is it possible to analyze a poem? And of course it is. Like, of course, there's so much there to read into it and to think with it. And I think, um, somebody had just reposted the poem of Larry Levis's that I posted on Twitter, and they were like, I don't understand this ending. Can somebody help tell me what it means? And it's so hard. You can't say it's right. There's not that one truth. There isn't like, this is what this poem means. So one has to be careful not to, as Badu says in the end of his chapter, that, and he's, well, maybe he was quoting something else, but he says, to demand the disillusion of the mystery of the poem, um, to delineate from the outset the limits of the power of language. So you can't ruin the mystery by overanalyzing it, right? That said, there's something about this poem that feels like it just feels like existence. Like it feels like this is what it means to be alive. And you glimpse yourself in another universe in the window,
Yeah.
and you have to bear what you know, and you can't bear it. That's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, Badu has this line that what does he say? Emily Dickinson discovered modern individuality
Oh my God.
in this idea of knowledge of the no one, knowledge of the anonymous one.
Totally.
I mean, Harold Bloom's always talking about that with Whitman.
Shakespeare. Oh yeah.
Well, also with Whitman though, as like the distinct American version of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that this poem here is interesting because on the one hand, there's a lot of shame
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He
and
has
this
so much shame in his work.
oh god, I mean it's almost a little grueling, but he adds humor to it to kind of balance it a little bit
Yeah.
so that it works. But that idea of like, what are you really when you're not tapped into the no one, into the anonymous anyone,
Mm-hmm.
which is also no one or something like that,
Yep.
which itself is a place of knowledge. It's not a place of existence. So he's kind of saying the place of existence is actually this like don't know, like you're in the mud, you're in the wormish, like you're in, that's existence. That's the shame in a certain way. But then he has a relief or an optimism because he also knows how to. So it's that kind of split
Oh, is in the
subject.
mud, is that no one? That's not no one when you're in the
No,
mud.
no one. I understand by no one to be him tapping into a form of the knowledge of the non-I, of the kind of like
Yeah.
the I that does the real work of poetry in some ways.
Yeah.
Not the ego, maybe.
Yeah. The ego doesn't wanna be no one. It
Exactly.
wants to be someone.
Yeah, but when he's like whatever looking at other humans, he's seeing them as egos. He's not seeing them. So that's kind of the sad part of the poem in a way or something
Yeah.
like that. Um but that's what struck me is that kind of he's really kind of talking about that split subjectivity in a certain way. Um yeah.
Yeah, and he's always it's interesting because there's always this not always, but a lot of time there's this meta, um, conversation about poetry itself, which is, um, uh now I'm trying to think of the Badu part 2, or it was he sort of come to this idea of, like, it's not that the poem shows the poet thinking the thought,
Mm.
but it's not right, it's not thinking about the thought, but somehow it is actually thinking the thought in the poem. Somehow you recreate the experience of thinking in a poem.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Yeah,
why for him, Pessoa, Fernando Pessoa is the premier poet of 20th century because he creates like, I don't know, like almost a dozen
personas.
personas.
Yeah. His are very deliberate.
Yeah, and each one, not each one, but several of them um are concocted in such a way that they have like no relation to the others. So then like what does that tell you about the
Hmm.
core subjectivity of the poet themselves? That's quite interesting. That goes back to the Emily Dickinson idea.
That's
Um,
I wonder if that's even possible for one poet to write personas that have nothing to do with the
well, I
other.
think that's kind of the argument that Badiou and his partner Judith Balso argue about Pessoa. This in this book, Balso calls him the metaphysical courier. And I'm not really an expert on Pessoa, so I couldn't articulate it well.
Me either, but
But
yeah,
that's kind of where I mean, it's worth investigating,
totally.
and maybe I should do a program on it, or you should,
Yeah.
or we should. But nonetheless, I really love that idea, and I wanted to actually ask you what the meaning of Emily Dickinson is for you as a poet, as an American poet. Obviously talked about quite a lot, but what do you find singular in her work for you? Is she like a central name or I mean,
Well, it's totally she's one of those amazing poets too that, like, you come to when you can. Like, it's weird that she's taught to children first because I find her a very singular and complex poet, actually. And it takes time to come to Emily Dickinson and fall in love. The other night I was feeling so much anxiety in my having, like, sleep anxiety, about, God, I could have even been thinking about this podcast actually, because thinking about learning all of Marxism and Nietzsche and the
I'm
philosophical
terrorizing you,
tradition.
Bianca.
Yeah,
I'm
you
so
are
sorry.
haunting me. Well, for a lot of reasons, it meant a lot to me. Oh, but I kept thinking of it like was haunting me. Her line, "I am nobody. Who are you?" And you nobody too. And it was like the only thing that comforted me. And I wouldn't even say comfort is the right word. It just sustained me to, like, keep going. Um, just in that moment of restless anxiety. And right, so I would agree with Badu in this respect too. There's something about her that is so and it's kind of part of her mystique too around her life and everything is that she is so anonymous and so present at the same time. It's almost like she's speaking posthumously all the time when she's alive. And her language is so strange and fragmented that you can only assume she had a completely unique experience with language and I would say non-language, right? So empty space the dash, the unfinished, the fragmented. And so right there, somebody who just embodied a kind of living poetry. I mean, and yet disembodied utterly. There's the contradiction around her as as a person and a poet and in her poetry, so profound. And talk about analyzable and unanalyzable is like, I love the Emily Dickinson Museum is doing such a good job, and they always are posting her poems and saying, "What do you think this poem's about?" And it's so fun to read all the different takes on it because you can get so endless amount of meaning out of her work. There's no single meaning, and we'll never know the single meaning, and there isn't one.
Yeah.
But there's someone tapped into death and sexuality and I would even say like disruption and trauma for sure, but it's not, there's somebody who plays it so well. It's built into the language itself. It's not this like narrative stream of surface level experience. You know, she only could go directly into language and silence and fragmentation in order to capture these most complex of experiences. A genius for sure.
I know. I once read a story about how she, I think, had lunch with Ralph Waldo Emerson once, and she was very saddened apparently because they never got to meet again. But she said it was like one of the most momentous experiences of her life. And I think the bottom line was he walked away like, okay, I don't know if I'm impressed by, or whatever, something like that, which must have been heartbreaking for her.
So heartbreaking.
Um,
But who got, well, I guess they're both pretty famous, but
yeah, yeah. Well, I feel like I have like actually many more questions, but I also want to be respectful of your time. But could I perhaps kind of close us with a question, which you sort of mentioned a moment ago, because you've been doing so much work in psychoanalysis. One of the questions I had for you is sort of, and I think this might be helpful for people listening to this. How do, because I feel like there's a certain intimidation with poetry interpretation and like the critics. And
yeah.
First of all, so it's a two-part question. Is every poet also a critic of poetry in general? I guess they must be. I want your take on that. And I also want to know like how you go about interpreting poems. Or do you take like a minimalist approach? Do you take a psychoanalytic approach sometimes? Or one could see that the psychoanalytic approach might be perceived, perhaps rightly, as overbearing or as somehow too intrusive or as somehow, like Ashbery said, like, so what if it's about my mother? Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Sorry, I'm just killing a tick.
oh yeah, you're in the country.
Oh, fucking bastard. Okay.
I have dealt with ticks my whole life.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm from
They're
Oregon.
so bad. They're so bad right now.
Oh my God, they are. I know they freak me out too with kids. My little boy, like, we went camping once, and 2 weeks after camping, I was giving him a haircut, and the big old tick was engorged in his head.
No, it's so awful when they're engorged.
Well, it was like, okay, so engorged. Okay, no, so not fully engorged, sorry, but like,
but if they've
like
been on
kind
for
of getting there, kind of
yeah.
getting there. But I guess engorged means like deep, deep. It was like semi-deep.
Well, it means
That's
that they've
scary.
been feeding off of you and they're fatter, and then you have to take antibiotics, and it sucks.
Yeah, totally. So tell me, like, how do you analyze poems? How can you recommend a novice, if that's the right word? Like, because I feel like maybe for people that listen to my show, they're inclined to philosophy, right?
Right.
Maybe they don't read much poetry, but maybe an interpretive way in could be a way for them to cultivate a love for poetry. You know?
Totally. Okay, so the first question is,
How do you do it? How do you do it for you?
yeah.
And then what would you advise others? And then third, sorry, I ask a lot of questions. What are the merits of psychoanalysis for analyzing poems?
Okay, I love this. Now, let's, thinking about the Badu piece when he's talking about how Mathame aligns itself more with, um, how, philosophy works, right? And that the poem is, uh it doesn't work in the way that you can, follow the discursive thread and come to conclusion, right? It's not the logical path, right? So I would, and there's overlap. Okay, it's not an absolute, and he goes into how they go back and forth a little bit too. But when you're approaching a poem, the first and foremost thing to do would be to let go of all that expectation of figuring out the meaning and letting the poem happen. This is not, for me, it's intuitive because I grew up with poetry and didn't feel like I had to answer those questions. What is it about? Um, that said, I grew up around fairly accessible poetry and not John Ashbery or, you know, even Rilke for that matter. But so letting the poem happen to you and seeing what happens. And a lot of times that a poem is an experience, right? So I remember my therapist quoting Fromm once and saying what a patient needs is an experience, not a theory, right? And so a poem is an experience, and you don't have to understand what an experience means to get something out of it. Then I would say you get to do the fun part of rereading it, because the first read, usually a lot of times you don't know what it meant. And people are scared to read poetry because they think they have to parse out the riddle. Poets love to say poetry is not a riddle. The truth of the matter is it is a riddle, but there's not one answer. So you get to have this really great experience of investigating the poem. And the more poetry you read and reread, sometimes you just read it and enjoy it. Other times, like me, like I keep going back to a certain poem and I'm like, "Oh my god, there's so much here." And I love hovering over that and connecting it to other things because it will connect to many other things. And especially if you're a philosopher, you'll be, and this is why Adam Phillips talks so much about how psychoanalysts use poetry when they're talking about their theories, is because, and philosophers do this too, sometimes they need poetry to stand as lines of poetry as an example of parts of their argument, parts of their theory, which have a part of it that's unknowable or contradictory or ineffable, that there's some, right? Because that's what poetry does, right? It holds that truth and lie in the same place. And so you can use poetry in that way. But that requires you reading poetry, investigating poetry, finding different poems that you like, and the ones, it's so much fun. It's so much fun to be like, "Oh my god, there's this Mallory poem that I can quote now when I'm teaching," because it gets at something, and it always, for some reason, people will resonate and listen to you because you have this, there's aesthetic involved in this. It's beautiful, it's musical, it's strange. So yes, analyze poetry, and then always, as in psychoanalysis, any good psychoanalysis should acknowledge too the unknowability of the analysis. There will always be parts that are unfinished, unspoken, ineffable. What the hell was that Black House experience? I don't know. I can't figure it out. I've written hundreds of words on it. I can't figure it out, right? I'll never fully understand maybe. But right. So I guess I kind of went into the second part of the question, which is like,
Yeah.
well, it was,
How you use psychoanalysis to analyze poetry and what the limits are to that,
okay,
where it's
that's
like, yeah,
different.
this question of like, because you could kind of have a pompous attitude where you'd be like, yeah, I can kind of figure it out. I have all these
I
theoretical
mean,
instruments available to know.
this
I don't know if
poor
anybody does that, but I guess
this
if you're very trained,
mm,
you could.
yeah, well, I can't help it now. So I do manuscript consults, and it feels like a therapy session. I've read their whole manuscript, and I'm like, all right, why are you totally avoiding, like, talking about this the father here? Is like, obviously you want to, obviously, it's kind of terrible for me to use the father as an example, but I'm very keen now, and because I'm just adept at reading poetry because I've been doing it so long, is that I can read into it, is that, like, I can see what people are avoiding, and it's not that they're avoiding it because the poem demands it. They're avoiding it for psychological reasons that is harming the poem, right? And it's not even about one's personal story, but it's like when one is writing about personal experience in all the lyrical and fictional and dreamlike ways that one goes about it, if you're not dealing with 'cause the superego is part of this too. It's to see if you're writing from a place of over editing because the superego is getting in the way of who it thinks you are, that's gonna stop you from writing. So I bring this into the classroom. I bring this into my one-on-one mentorship because it's helpful. Not I try my hardest to not speak like an analyst, right? Because I'm not an analyst at all. I'm not trained in that way. I've just read. And but many other poets have too. I read Ed Hirsch's beautiful book on how to read a poem and fall in love with poetry, which I'd recommend for everybody. And it's highly accessible New York Times bestseller, but it's also like one of the best books about poetry ever written. And he's clearly somebody who understands the psychoanalytical phenomenon of the relational experience and how that overlaps with the poem. And he uses that. So, but there's this problem that happens in poetry workshop where everybody overanalyzes the poem and they want too much meaning out of it and they want it to be more clear. Now, the problem of clarity, precision, coming towards epiphany, speaking plainly, not being vague, that's something I am constantly working on as a workshop teacher because you don't wanna kill on one hand, the mystery of the poem. You always have to let that nonsense be there, and you have to embrace and love the nonsense. I mean, it's so gross to, like, overanalyze an Ashbery poem, sorry, like, sometimes it just kills it, and I'm not no shade to your friend who sounds like you wrote a really cool thing about it at all, and sometimes we have to go really far just to make a point, right? But in terms of just, like, enjoying the poem and just letting it be a poem, it's a delicate balance, and uh the problem becomes in workshop is that people are like, "Well, I want it to not mean anything." And I'm like, "I meant it to be vague."
Mm,
I'm like, "Okay, but the poem kinda sucks." Like, there's that, like, I'm not let into your idea enough.
mm,
And there is an element of, like, having actual things you wanna say and saying
mm,
them and, like,
mm.
standing behind them, and
Yeah,
therapies taught me that too. Like I said about the virtue, it's like, I wanna speak my mind, I wanna speak who I am. And that doesn't mean it's all, uh, laid bare with no mystery,
right.
but it's a certain precision in language, and it's not hiding from your own voice. You cannot hide from your own voice, and philosophers, I'm sorry, but they have this problem too, where they just don't let people in sometimes, and right? So
Mm,
it would be beneficial to read complex poems that also let people in, right? So, like, having this sort of gateway for the relational experience with the reader is very important because then you get together, you make meaning, right? Out of your incredible idea, which inevitably, given the unconscious, has to have lots of holes in it, right? I mean, it has to have an unknowability to it, right? Wouldn't
yeah,
it be incredible to, like, let the reader do a little work too to, like, making that become? But let's say, philosophers too, like, they'll respond and, like, disagree with one another, but there's something in just, like, letting the reader in, letting in the relational experience, and I don't know. I
yeah, it
guess
makes it makes sense. I can see that for younger poets, probably would be a tendency. to feel like actually my poem will be superior or more effective if I keep a barrier.
Right.
But you're kind of saying, and
But why?
your age and experience, yeah, you're pushing against this, and you're kind of pushing against this.
Because then I
Also,
think, oh, do you hate the reader? Are you projecting onto the reader here? You know?
but yeah, but you're also saying that the mystery remains even when you bring them in.
Of course.
Yeah.
If you brought them in and there was no mystery, then you don't have a poem, right? Because
Yeah.
you're including your own acknowledgement
I,
of your
I have
mystery.
like a encore question, if I could, which is poetry a spiritual enterprise, a spiritual approach for you? Does spirituality enter into this zone of unknowability and this intersubjective communication? Have you thought about naming that something like a spiritual experience, or is that actually not necessary because spirituality means something kind of commodified, or it means something other than this?
I
Like,
can't. Yeah, go
yeah.
on. Go on.
No. I mean, that's my question, really. It's sort of like,
I
because
think
I do think the intuition of the masses is that poetry is really a spiritual enterprise, at the end of the day, and that's fine, or it seems to me that people feel that way intuitively, or just kind of
it
whatever.
should be. I don't think there's enough of that, you know?
Oh, really?
Totally. I feel like my poetry opened up so much when I let in the spiritual exploration, which came naturally, you know? And you come to a certain point in your life where you stop, like when I think of Nietzsche saying God is dead and finding a new language for spirituality and for God, that's what it means to me, like filling that space with new meaning. And to cut that off, to say, "Oh, I'm not spiritual." I mean, what a handicap as a writer, you know? For me, it's it's talking about the unseen, and if that's what poetry is, there's so much work in terms of the silence of knowledge about whether or not there is a God, the silence of why are we here, and um, that's where language comes in. I mean, I think so much. I know that the in the beginning was the word is historically got a lot more to it, but I think about it a lot in terms of the beginning, and I think about how language is and consciousness are all wrapped up in one another, and that I mean, like, and we didn't even get into like consciousness as being in a like post-Cartesian way, like not just confined to the thinker person,
Right.
but like that in some ways humans have this strange phenomenon of language and thought together.
Right.
And that to me, it speaks to something so ancient, unknowable, and I link it utterly to the spiritual. For me, that is a dimension of this exploration that cannot be ignored, and Roca knew that. I mean, and he and you we rewrite it, we write into it. Again, that, like, not one must speak from uh, their own attentive gaze at the world, and, that is that it's such rich material. And the other thing I'll say about God is that the more I think about the strangeness of the unconscious, the more I think, and I kind of came to this in the Black House book poems. So, like, God is in the Black House, and there was something about God that feels connected to the unconscious, and I can't. It's like it somehow, and death, and how it exists in us at all times, and that we won't be whole, and we won't know any of that till after. I love that. That gives me that's just, like, so much there. What about you?
Um, I think so. I mean, one of the things I feel that poetry should be inducted in the service of is is developing um, collective myths that can um, transcend this kind of capitalist individualism that
Yeah.
that we live in. So I'm always interested in, and I think it's rare. I think it's very rare to have a poet or a series of poems that can speak to a collective. I'd be interested in that.
Yeah.
Um, you know what I'm saying? And so that we could call that kind of like like poetry as a political mythology is interesting to me.
Oh, I love that.
Is poetry a spiritual approach? I mean,
That's just one
in
dimension of
some
it.
sense, it is. For
Yeah.
me, it is because for me, I mean, for me, poetry is many things. But one of the things for me that I think it really is, it's sort of like because I'm like a thinker, right? So I'm always living in books, and I learned that was my calling when I was in my early 20s, and it just kind of that's been my thing. And to the detriment of like many other things, like I don't know how to play instruments because all I do is like read. It's like I'm too like maniacally focused on that, and
Yeah, you're
I
very I can
generate
tell.
all of my attention to that.
Yeah.
And poetry is actually like a way of mediating that intensity, kind of taking it down a few notches, and
Mhm.
that's why it brings me a feeling of relief sometimes
Totally.
to work on poetry, and even poetry that's hard, so called. It still can feel like a relief to me. Um, and yeah, like the spiritual dimension is essential. The sacred dimension is this whole notion of the unseen, even in Islamic poetry, is so alluring and fascinating to me that I want to study more.
Yeah.
Um, the mystical part of that is so rich, and
Right.
uh so it's definitely that, but I feel also that it's um it's also something that, yeah, like this idea, also the way that I listen to music is similar to the way I read poetry, which is I fall in love with songs and I kind of re-listen to them, and I feel that like I become amazed and in awe, like a feeling of awe of their achievement. So that's the kind of reader that I am. I'm probably not the kind of reader that would like read a whole chapbook or a whole book of poems, and like probably the reader that would like identify two or three that really moved me and just be like
Right.
obsessed with them.
Right.
So I'm pretty singular in that way. I want to do more poetry criticism. That might be something I could challenge myself to do in the future. Maybe. Um, but I've always had a strong interest in it, and it's been such a delight to chat with you. You've been on a roll, by the way. You're saying some very brilliant things. So I'm excited to share this with everybody.
I was gonna say too that while you were talking, it made me think just quickly that like poetry and divine it was always thought to be in half of it at least divinely inspired. The poets speak for the gods. And that's a powerful position to be in. But it's
Yeah, you
also
think,
a learned thing. So
right?
it's like, oh, I go to school for it, but also I speak for the gods, you know. Also I'm an oracle. So it's still there.
Yeah, no, that is, oh my
But
gosh,
how
that
much
is
would
so right.
the, like, state of the church would, like, hate that, you know? Um, or that is, and that it's interpretive, you know? It would be dangerous for organized religion who wants to say
Do
they
you
only
believe in this Socratic idea of the daimon? Do you know what this is? The daimon. It's like this idea that you have an inspired. So I just want to say something like I've come to kind of believe in it actually. This is
okay.
spiritual, which is the idea kind of like this. Um yeah, there's the oracle, but there's also like a kind of positive super egoic force, and even there's been a lot of Freudian analysts that have talked about the Socratic daimon through the notion of super ego, but it's not a super ego that's necessarily a censorship based. It's a muse. It's a muse
Uh-huh.
that pushes you, and that kind of is the source of a type of communication to the other world. It's like your thing that keeps you tethered also to your project. So for me, like when I wrote my last book, I felt like I had to have, I don't know, I felt like I was tapped into something like that because my discipline was, when you can just produce and it was like, whoa, I can't believe I did that. And,
Yeah.
and then you also feel good about what you produced.
Yeah.
So I always feel like it's also dangerous because there's moments where the diamond goes away and you're on
Mhm.
your own.
Mhm.
You're on your own and it's like you want where did you go, man? Like, I need you back. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? And so, like, what did I do to be in your good graces?
Ah,
So it's like there's that
great.
whole thing, like,
Well, this idea too that you, like, have to, you can't just wait around for the muse, right? You kinda have sometimes you just gotta work.
do
But
you feel
also
that you have muse? Is a muse like a what is a muse for in your vision?
well, there's, like, a literal person in one's world that can garner a lot of creative inspiration just by your love of them, right? So love is very powerful in this way, and usually it's, like, interestingly, I find love that is not sexual, right? So it can't be consummated in that way, or it's like yearning or something like that. But I don't think of the muse that way anymore. Um,
That would be like the muse as mentor or the muse as highly accomplished. Um, is that right? So you're saying?
no, not as mentor, but as somebody uh, uh, it's like they're your muse because maybe they see you, maybe they really see you, and there's something beautiful about them, and you see that beauty, and maybe you idealize them too, but your sort of like creative libidinal energy is like activated by them, right? It's weird, but like I'd even say like my analyst in a weird way like has been very I'd never even thought about it till just now, and it feels kind of embarrassing to even say it, but like there's something about the like energy of our relationship that is a lot on my end, just a lot in my head too, but, like, it's something about it stirs, exploration of very complex topics, and he is in mind. Now, but what you're talking about is something more archetypal, It's something more in that unseen other realm that I think, the Jungians explored, and Donald Kalscheit, who is an amazing Jungian analyst and writer, has looked at too, in terms of like talking about different figures that pop up that either can be, um, they can be very destructive figures, and they can be very creatively inspired figures, and they live in you, they live in the unconscious, but they make themselves known in different ways. But
Wow.
I think
Yeah.
that'd be like, um but I don't like this sort of idealized muse person, but there's no doubt about the fact that real people in our
Yeah.
relationships and in our lives inspire us.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Well, we've been going for over
I
2 hours,
know, I'm
and
sorry, yeah.
no, 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 please, please. This has been one of the most enjoyable sessions that I've had in a very, very long time, and so,
Oh, me too.
um, wanna thank you. I'm sorry for giving you so much, like, homework, but I feel like it, like, paid off because you just said some really brilliant things, and, I think you went on some very interesting tangents, and I asked you a bunch of questions that you had no preparation for, but it all worked out really well.
As it should be, right?
Yeah,
For a podcast. Well, I'm
yeah,
so excited for the Badoo book, and this I read it twice because it was hard for me the first time. It took a while for me, and, like, a lot of the references I had to look up,
yeah.
but then it really opened up to me, and I am so excited for it and for the rest of the book, so
Maybe
thank you.
you ought to start assigning, because I can send you some stuff he writes on poetry that's a
Oh,
lot
I'm
more
definitely
accessible.
assigning this, yeah,
Assigning it, yeah, for
yeah.
your courses, yeah.
Well, I'm like, I'm the next class I'm gonna do is gonna be on, like, the lyrical science of the psyche and poetry and philosophy. I'm including more philosophy now, and I feel
Nice.
so excited about it.
Okay, well,
Thank you, Daniel.
yep. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, everybody, for
Yeah.
listening to this incredible journey, and, until next time, everybody, take care.